So I want to start with a little bit of context in terms of how I want to frame this session here, and then talk a little bit about some of the big picture goals and the things that I'm hoping you'll take away from it rather. So this is a session that's meant to think about being intentional in terms of professional development opportunities and accomplishments and skills that you may want to acquire during your graduate program. And it's important to remember that graduate school is a time to be doing things that will help you prepare for what comes next. And in many cases, it's going to be the specific training that you may be doing, the coursework that you're taking, the research that you may be doing, the things that are just part of the progress to degree. But in some cases, there are opportunities to do other associated activities that can be really beneficial as well. And these may not be the sort of things that are going to be a requirement from your program, like presenting at conferences or publishing in journals or sort of things like that. But there may be really key to helping you prepare for that next step for where it is that you want to go with whatever your degree is here. And so the goal here is to really think about what the end result that you might want is going to be. And the purpose of this is not to try to get you locked in on a certain path if maybe you're not sure. Some people go in are pursuing a graduate degree because they have a very clear idea of what this is going to do, a qualification, a credential that may be important to a certain outcome there. In other cases, people may just be really interested in a subject or interested in research, and maybe open to taking those skills and that experience in a different, several different directions potentially afterwards. This is really just to get you to be intentionally reflecting on these things along the way while recognizing that things may change. You may end up pivoting in other directions, and that's fine here. But hopefully you'll be doing that in a way that is intentional and thinking about how it's going to connect with other opportunities. Because graduate school isn't a destination, it should be a bridge to something. That something can change. It could be multiple somethings, depending on interests that you might have there. But this is a training experience and a chance to gain some particular skills here is for that. And so with that in mind, the goals that I have for our session tonight are a few things. One, I want to share a couple of tools that can be useful for doing a little bit of professional development, reflection, and planning. And I have drawn upon some of those resources in putting together this particular session here. We'll do a little bit of brainstorming about the resume or the CV that you would like to have, and then thinking about how we can create some goals related to that end product, and then do a little bit of planning to think about how you can begin achieving those things here and putting this in the context of the type of the amount of time you have in your particular program here. And I'll say, regardless of where you're at, if you're just beginning a grad program or whether you're getting closer to the end, I think all these things are applicable, and you can just adapt them to the time frame that you have for the course of your program and for whatever stage you're at in it. All right. So as I said before, grad school for most degrees is a multi-year process. If you're in a doctoral program, depending on your field, we could be looking at 5, 7, even more years of time. Even if it's a master's program, it's maybe 2 years. In most cases there, this is still an amount of time that's significant and something that you want to be intentional about in terms of how you're approaching what it is that you want to do there. And thinking about what it is that you want to get out of your experience, not just the degree itself there. And this can include what you want to use that degree for as you finish up and move on to whatever comes next year. But it also includes the things that you need to be doing to make good progress in your degree there. Program milestones that you may need to do. You may have to pass some qualifying exams or comprehensive exams. You may have to defend a proposal. There may be a practicum or an internship that's part of the degree program there. If it's a PhD program, there's going to be the writing of a dissertation and its defense. And so obviously planning to make sure that you are going to be on track to accomplish all those things, but then also thinking about, again, what it is that you're hoping to get out of the larger experience. Why are you pursuing this particular degree? And again, it's never too early to start thinking about what it is that you want to do after what comes next here. And related to that question, one thing to think about there as well is, what are the things that you maybe haven't done yet that you would like to be able to have for that CV or resume when you finish up your time in graduate school here? And that's what I mean when I say we're going to begin with the end in mind here. We're going to do a little bit of envisioning about what we might want that CV or resume to look like and then think about what sort of accomplishments and credentials you have now, and how we can then plan with the time that you have available to try to bridge whatever gap might be the case there, to see if you can get those particular accomplishment skills, or whatever it might be that you're particularly looking for by the time that you're able to finish graduating here. And again, I'm going to be assuming that anybody, has a certain level of preparation already. Again, you may be thinking about this, you may already have some intentional goals there, in which case I hope this was a useful refresher around this particular topic here. But if you're just starting out and you haven't really thought about this as well, that's fine too. This is just something to think about going forward, some things to flag about, and we'll do some things that are hopefully going to make this a little bit more concrete. So starting just big picture for anybody who hasn't really thought about, what that postgraduate experience might look like, there are some tools that can be useful for doing a little bit of self-reflection and a little bit of career planning here. So there are two useful resources that offer similar types of things in terms of some personal assessment and some opportunities to do a little bit of career exploration and some goal setting. If you are in a science discipline and a STEM field, My IDP is a tool that's particularly designed for that, with science careers in mind. Humanities and social sciences, there's a resource called Imagine PhD. Both of them are free. You can create accounts for them. I will be drawing on some materials that come from both of those sites there, and I'll share a handout related to one of them a little bit later in tonight's session. But again, if you're just wondering, what can I do with these skills? What am I even interested in? There are some assessments that you can do, just some self-reflection to kind of gauge your interest. There's also some examples of some different types of careers that people with particular types of graduate degrees have done, and give you some sense about what that might look like and how you might be able to translate some of the experiences and skills that you have and are gaining as a graduate student to pursuing that type of work there. So even if you already have a fairly clear idea, I want to be a professor, or I want to go into this particular industry role, um, or I want to be an administrator in my organization, I think it can still be helpful to look at these resources there, because sometimes things can change. And I think it's always useful to get a sense of the range of options that you may be being prepared for that you haven't maybe necessarily thought of in the same way. Because there are some career paths that might be pretty obvious in terms of what you might do with this particular degree, a master's of science or a PhD. There are other options that may not be on everybody's radar. And so even if you feel pretty confident, it doesn't hurt to just explore a little bit around that. And if you're just wide open and you're not even sure, you're here because you're interested in a particular research topic or a particular discipline, and you haven't really fully thought through where that's going to be going beyond that, this can be a useful way to do a little bit of that reflection there. So something else that's going to be important and we're going to work through reflecting on is thinking about, as we're trying to envision what that future CV looks like, as we're trying to envision what that next step might look like, trying to set some good goals for that. And so the concept of SMART goals is something you may have encountered before, but this is just a little way of breaking down the features of a strong goal that is going to be something that is actionable and you'll be more likely to achieve here. So this is really just a way of thinking about what are the qualities of a good goal that I can set here. Is it specific? Is it something that it's really relatively clear what the area of focus is there? Is it measurable? This one is really, really important. Can you determine whether you did it or not? Complete a summer internship. That is a measurable goal. You did it or not. Get more research experience. That's a little vague. What does more mean? Something like that. Not the greatest goal. Be trained in this particular method. Sure, that's something specific. You have competency in it or you don't. Publish an article in this particular journal. Again, that's something measurable. You know, gain a certain level of proficiency in a particular foreign language. Again, that's something that's measurable there. So making sure that you have that ability to determine whether you accomplished what it is you intended to or not is going to be really important. It's also important to make sure that what it is that you're planning to do is tied to some sort of next step. There might be a goal, there might be a way to measure whether you achieved it or not, but it may not be clear how you go about doing it there. So there should be some sort of action that's going to come out of that goal that you're going to be able to pursue there. Maybe if it's enrolling in a language class, if the goal is to master a particular language that's important to your research there. That might be an action-oriented thing because now you can sign up for that next semester, or you can apply for an opportunity like the Critical Language Scholarship or the Boron Awards that will let you do intensive language study or something. Realistic is important as well because there are a lot of goals that may be bigger picture ones you want to set, but that may need to be broken down into some smaller steps in terms of the amount of time you have, particularly if we're thinking about what you can accomplish as a graduate student. Is this something that you can actually do based on the complexity of the task, on the difficulty, and on the amount of time there? Maybe that long-term goal is to be the head of a particular organization. That may not likely to be the first destination after you finish your degree in most cases. And so there are probably going to be some intermediate steps along the way. But you can be thinking about, what are the things that can set me up so that I can take that first step on the path that's going to lead me to that sort of thing there. Are there things that I can do now to start developing leadership skills? Are there ways that I can start networking, do some informational interviews that are going to get me connected with people who might be able to give me some insight and maybe even some support and connections within a particular area. So thinking about that realistic piece. And then time bound is also something that I would really emphasize as well. Some cases you may have a deadline that's imposed on you. You may need to complete your coursework by a certain date, or you may need to defend a dissertation proposal by a certain date, or you may have to graduate by a certain time, or else you're going to run out of funding that's coming from your program there. In other cases, though, things may be a little more ambiguous. And in that case, I think it's really helpful to just set a deadline for yourself. Even if it is something that might end up changing, even if it's a little bit of a soft deadline, I think having a time-bound component to it is a good way of providing some structure and some accountability to that. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll have a handout that will help visualize that a little bit later as a way to do that. So we'll come back to this idea of SMART goals. Again, you may have encountered this in other settings before. And we'll kind of go through the process of starting bigger picture and trying to make it down to an end product that then fits this particular model here. But I wanted to introduce that at the beginning so that we have that as a common framework going forward. All right, so with that in mind, thinking about again, what do we want to do in grad school? How do we make SMART goals? How do we prepare for what comes beyond that? I would recommend thinking about at the very least a year by year, if not even more specific, maybe semester by semester, in some cases month by month, plan for achieving those particular goals. But at the very least, I think it's useful to check in every year that you are in a particular program, particularly if you're a doctoral student or you're in a longer program, to see what kind of progress you're making, to see if you have the same goals that you originally did or if you were pivoting in a different direction. And one thing that I think can be helpful in all of this is to draw on a concept that some of you, if you've done some workshops on teaching or through the Center of Teaching Excellence, may have encountered, which is the idea of backwards design. So this is something from teaching and pedagogy, where it's the idea that when you are designing a course that you're going to teach, that you start with the learning outcomes you want your students to achieve first, and then you move backwards from there in terms of the type of activities that you'll do in class, the type of assessments, and those sort of things there. So it's really thinking about the end goal that you want to have, and then making sure that everything leads up to the achievement of that particular goal. And I think this is a concept that we can apply to professional development. And so in this case, we're thinking about resumes and CVs a little bit, just in terms of those being documents that capture certain qualifications that you have. So imagine again, what is it that you would want to have by the time of graduation? What are the things that you want to be able to list on that particular document? Because that's going to help us start that backward design process and think about what are the steps we need to do along the way so that by the time you have that degree in hand, you also have those other things that you'd like to go along with that. Once again, if you're in a situation where maybe you're not sure, maybe this is something you've thought a little bit about or not at all, that's fine as well. I would encourage you to think a little bit about perhaps what are some of the things that peers in your program, somebody who's a little further along, may have done. What's typical for the type of other students in your program? And I'm thinking again, particularly for those of you who are in research-based programs, MA, MS, PhD programs here. That can be helpful as a way to figure out some of the things that you may want to do if you're not entirely sure, what the ideal CV or resume might look like. But There's some other things you can do that can help you figure out some of those things and help you figure out where you might actually want to go in terms of those next steps, in addition to the resources that I mentioned before. And so another question to be asking, in addition to what are the sort of things that people in my program are doing typically, if I'm a first year PhD student, what are the fourth years doing? How many conferences have they gone to? Have they published work? Have they done internships? Have they been trained in certain things? Have they gotten certain qualifications from their program or from other opportunities there? Another thing in addition to that is thinking about who's getting hired in the kind of jobs that you're interested in doing or in the type of career paths there. Regardless of what that goal is, this is something you can think about. And in this case here, particularly, who is getting hired, the kind of jobs you're interested in, relatively close to their graduate training. If this is something that you want to do after grad school, or for people who are relatively new in those roles there. Because somebody may have earned a degree a decade ago and have done a lot of things that intervening time that's maybe prepared them for a certain role. That's all well and good, but that's not really something you can start planning for right now. But somebody who's maybe a little bit more recent in terms of finishing their education or moving into a position, that is a little bit easier to gauge the kind of qualifications and experiences they may have had while they were still graduate students that you might be able to try to emulate in some ways. So if you're interested in a faculty career, if you want to be a professor, who are the assistant professors who were hired in your field in the last cycle? You can find some information on job boards, like Higher Ed Careers, Chronicle of Higher Education, Academic Job Wiki. And you can see, from the previous cycle, based on positions that were advertised, who was hired in those positions. And in many cases, you can find people's CVs. They might have personal websites or they might be listed on their institution that they're at. And you can do a little bit of internet sleuthing to figure some of these things out there. Look at the dates on things there. If they earned their PhD in 2023, what are the things that are listed in that same year or before on the CV? Because that gives you some idea of things that they may have done as a graduate student. Awards maybe they won, journals they published in, fellowships, grants that they may have applied for, professional experiences that they may have sought out there, or things that may have been in the works in graduate school as well. So, maybe they had a publication that came out 6 months after they graduated. Okay, that was probably something that they submitted while they were still finishing up their degree. So that's one way to think about that. Faculty careers, LinkedIn is a great resource if you're thinking about other sort of options there for industry, for government, for nonprofit jobs there. And that's another way to figure out roles that you might potentially be interested in with the training that you're doing. You can search and see, who has a Master of Science in engineering, and what are they doing there, and where did they do that, and what sort of information have they listed on their profile. That can be a way to get some sense of some of the experiences that they may have done in the course of a graduate program. They can give you some idea of some of the things that might be potential pathways to that career. Of course, everybody's life experience is different. Everybody brings different backgrounds, skills, abilities, talents, and things. And so, there's no sort of magic formula here, one to one, because one person did X and Y and they ended up in this place. If I do the same thing, I'm going to end up there. No, that's not how it works. But if you start looking at a number of different options, that'll give you at least a ballpark sense of some of the things that might be useful. And, use those research skills, those higher order thinking skills that you all have, and start looking for some of those patterns there. If you start seeing similar things, everybody in this field was funded by this particular award, or a lot of people seem to have done this one particular program here. Or it seems like, publications in this journal, are coming up again and again in my field here. Maybe that's one I should really target because it seems like the sort of thing that people think is really, a significant accomplishment. So these are some ways, if you're at that early stage and just trying to figure out what are my options or what are some of the things that maybe I would even want to have because I'm not sure what I want that CV or resume to look like, that can get you started thinking through some of these pieces here as well, in addition to those professional development websites that I mentioned before. Another thing, again, thinking particularly about anybody who might be thinking about an academic job or who's in a PhD program here, these are some of the common sections that you would find on an academic CV. Some of these are going to be more particular to some disciplines than others, so not every discipline is going to have each one of these, or they will not necessarily carry the same weight. But these are some general things you would expect to find if you look at the CV of a professor in your program, for example. And this can be a good starting point in terms of categories you might want to think about. Okay, are these things that I would want to be able to list something under? How important is that for me here? If you want to be a professor, publications are going to matter. So, that's definitely something there. Finding external funding can be important as well. If you want to have your own lab, or if you want to show that you are capable of attracting outside investment in the things that you're doing, applying for outside funding, which is what I work with students on, is one way to be able to do that as well. Different sorts of professional experiences like conference activity, service and leadership opportunities for your department, for the university, for professional associations, opportunities to engage in teaching and mentoring, formally or informally. In some disciplines, you may need to learn certain languages if you need to do field work, say, in another country, to demonstrate that, or certain technical skills, programming languages, knowledge of certain experimental techniques, competency in certain softwares. All of those are sort of things that you might potentially see on a CV or a resume. And so with internships, that's also something, if there are certain professional experiences that you might want to be thinking about as well. I'm not sure if anybody here is an international student, but I do just want to flag first that I'm not an immigration expert, and so please do not take this as advice about how to navigate the work authorization system in the United States. I do just want to flag, though, that there are sometimes special considerations for individuals who may be doing their graduate training who are from other countries, and thinking about what that might mean in terms of future career pathways. Because, if you are hoping to be able to remain working in this country, you're going to need to make sure that you have the right kind of residency and work authorization for that. And so, in addition to options that might be available through an employer who's sponsoring a visa, there are a couple opportunities to do a self-sponsored path to legal permanent residency. There's an EB-1 extraordinary ability and EB-2 national interest waiver qualification pathways there for individuals who have demonstrated that they are exceptional in their field, and particularly if they have skills and abilities that may be in demand in the United States. And so for anybody who may be considering that as a pathway, one of the things that you would need to do for that is to have evidence that demonstrates that you are, a leading expert in this particular area, that you have an established professional reputation, and that you have in-demand, skills and things there. And so some of the things that you might want to be thinking about are, what are those pieces of evidence that I can include for this? For research, it might mean citation indexes, impact factors from journals. Are the papers you're writing getting cited here? Are you being productive with your scholarship? Do you have peer-reviewed papers that have been either published or in process here? Have you been active in professional associations and conferences? Have you been invited to speak? Has there ever been any news stories done about work that you're part of here? Do you have any leadership experience? Do you have other scholars who can vouch for your work and your reputation? So again, this is not advice about how you should approach this here. It's just recognition of the fact that for students who are here from other countries, who are looking to remain here, that there are some different considerations that go into that. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but those are some things to be thinking about as well, that are going to help hopefully set you up for success to be able to pursue work here if that's the goal after you're finished with your training. And I have a link embedded here, and I will share these slides as a follow-up to everyone. And you can read a little bit more about this particular concept that I have listed at the bottom here. All right, so we've thought big picture about some of these things, about SMART goals, about some things to do a little bit of investigating here. Now it's your turn to do a little reflection on some of these things. I'm going to go ahead and I will put in the chat, give me a second to pull this up, a document that helps think through some categories that may be useful in terms of things that you may want to be doing in the course of your graduate program here. There's the chat. This is a resource from Imagine PhD. I'm going to share that, and then I'm going to share another worksheet. Then I'll jump back to the presentation. And so this first document, this PDF from Imagine PhD, are some different categories of things that you might be wanting to accomplish as a graduate student. And so again, if you haven't thought about, all right, there's the second one there. If you haven't thought about every single broad kind of category that you might want to be thinking about, these are some basic ones that would be important to have in mind there. So degree completion. What are the milestones that you have to do to actually be able to finish your degree here? Career development. What are the additional things beyond just the courses I'm taking, the things that I have to do just to get the diploma that might be important here? What are the skills that you might want to learn? Maybe they're specific concrete technical skills. Maybe they're soft skills, like I want to get more training in leadership or teaching and mentoring there. And then there's some more personal ones, the sort of things you wouldn't necessarily put on the CV, but that might be significant just for your own well-being. Making sure that you're providing a good, healthy balance with your work and other responsibilities and interests there, as well as making sure that you're have your needs met in terms of finances and things like that. So you can see some examples of some subcategories that are listed under all of these things on that handout from Imagine PhD. And I would encourage you, if you look at the worksheet, that second document that I sent you, to spend just a minute or two with those first two questions, thinking about the big categories that you would want to have for your own personal and professional development. And then what are some of those smaller categories that you would want to be able to break them down into? And in doing this, we're going to be working through the process of setting some SMART goals here. So I'll give everyone just a couple minutes to reflect on this a little bit. This is not something we have to complete right now, but I do want you to at least do a little bit of brainstorming here if you haven't had a chance to do that before. So I'll go ahead and give you a couple minutes now to do that. And if anyone feels like it, if you want to, you can put some examples in the chat if anybody feels like sharing an example of some of the categories that you came up with for your particular interests and goals here. So the next step, now that we've thought big picture and gotten a little bit more specific here, is to try to drill down a little bit more. Again, moving from larger desires to something that are SMART goals. So let's take some of those bigger picture items you've listed and see if we can break them down into something that is a measurable objective. Again, thinking about that SMART goals framework here. So these are just some examples of some things that might fit under this category. Maybe you want to publish a certain number of articles, or maybe you really want to publish an article in a particular journal. Okay, that's great there. Maybe you want to have a certain amount of conference activity that you're part of. Well, which conferences do you want to target? Are you looking for a certain number, or is there one that is particularly important in your field and that would really want to make sure that you've presented something there? Maybe you want to just get some sort of outside funding, a fellowship or a grant to show that you've been able to convince other people to invest in your training and the work that you're doing there. And so, okay, well, what are the opportunities that might be available to you? Again, that's what I work with students on here. So I'd be happy to talk with anybody individually to see what sort of options might be available in your particular program and situation there. Or maybe a particular skill or a desire to get some industry experience, for example, over a summer, things like that. So take a minute here and whatever it is that you had, this is thinking about the next statement, the third question here, and ask yourself, what's a measurable thing that I can put under here? And if you haven't thought about it, if you don't really know, what would be a good target to aim for, that's fine at this point. That's just something to kind of mentally flag and then maybe circle back to or talk with a faculty member or somebody else that's a little bit further along to try to get a sense of what that might look like. Because this is the sort of thing that varies substantially depending on the field that you're in. The number of publications that might be expected for graduate students in a lab science is going to be very different than what would be expected in a humanities doctoral program, for example. So make sure that you're comparing apples to apples here, and that you're not assuming that because some other student in a different type of program with a different type of degree is doing X and Y, that means you need to do the same thing to pursue your particular goals. But I'll give you a minute to think about some things that are going to be measurable, some things that might be quantifiable for that third question on the worksheet there to try to drill down a little bit more in the things that you've listed. All right, for the sake of time, we won't spend any more reflecting right now. But again, I encourage you not to end this right here, but to come back to these questions and to do a little bit of reflection um, to continue to think about what you might want to do with this. And again, these are things that might change over time. That's fine. The point is that you're being intentional and that you're thinking about setting SMART goals along the way here. And so the next step, now that you've had a chance maybe to at least brainstorm a couple of things that might be specific and quantifiable, is thinking about the timeline. What are the things, when are you going to need to achieve these particular things? Because again, having something that's time bound is an important part of a SMART goal because that provides some accountability. Or there may be things where there is already an external deadline and you need to make sure that you are going to meet it in order to be successful here. And so this is the same idea of backward design that I mentioned before as part of this. So what are the key steps you're going to need to take for these sort of things here? So for example, if you want to present your work at a particular conference, when does that conference take place? Is it the same time every year? In my graduate program, when I was doing my PhD, my professional organization, every November, that was their big conference. It changed locations every year, but the timing was relatively the same. It was sometime in mid-November usually. And that meant that for that particular conference, typically late February is when the proposals for it were due, abstracts, panels, and things like that. And so that meant some planning ahead. If I wanted to do something, say, for that particular conference this November, I would have had to have submitted something back in late winter, early spring. And that's likely the case in your field as well. So Same sort of thing. If you want to have a fellowship that's going to support you in, say, the second year of your degree program, in many cases, you might need to be applying for that a year in advance. If you're applying for the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, that deadline is next week, but the award is not going to start till September 1st of 2025. So thinking about what it is that you want and then making sure that you know the things you're going to need to do as part of that as well. Same thing with program milestones. Again, in some programs, you might need to do certain things at a certain point. Maybe everybody does their practicum in the third semester of a master's program, or you're expected to have finished your coursework and defended your dissertation proposal by your fifth semester, for example, here. Or you might be in a program where there's an extended research period. Maybe it's something like in anthropology where you're going to be doing field work, for an extended period of time, maybe a year or more as part of that. That might happen for most people at a certain time there. So what are the things you need to do to be prepared for that? Does it mean applying for funding? Does it mean learning certain skills, completing other sort of obligations there? With publications, it's also really important to think about what that timeline looks like as well. The time it can take from when you submit an article to when it finally comes out in print can be significant. This varies by journal and this varies by field, but you need to have some sense of what that can look like. You need to make sure you're leaving yourself time for revisions and resubmissions, or for the possibility, that a manuscript maybe isn't accepted at one journal, but then you might want to try to send it to a different one. And so, if the goal is to have a particular publication on the CV or the resume by the time you're applying for this particular job, or by the time you're finished with your program, that means you're going to have to be working ahead and think about, all right, when do I want to submit here so that I have time for that process to play out and so that I can have it at the state that I want it to be by the time that it's most useful to me as part of that. So to do that, one useful way I think is to do a little bit of visualizing. This is on the second page of the worksheet that I sent you here. This is a really easy template to adapt as well. So, if you want to do it differently, this one is organized with the one I have on the screen here is organized around the calendar year. You might choose to do it around the academic year. That's the way I did it for the handout. This is a 5-year plan. You might have more than 5 years. You might be looking at a 2-year plan or a 3-semester plan. So adapt it to whatever makes sense for the remaining time that you have in graduate school here, and organize it based on semesters or the calendar year, whatever makes the most sense for you, so that you can follow up on this. But this is just a nice way to visualize where you might have certain things that you are going to be doing. And you can you can rather write onto here some of the things that you might want to do as a way to provide a little bit of a visual reminder and a little bit of accountability. And so you might think about some categories, and I'll give you an example based on my own experience in a moment here. Some of those categories we were thinking about before around professional development activities, or finding funding, or time to degree sort of things there. You might color code that so you can keep track of that when you look at it and say, okay, I've got a lot of these things going on at this point here as well. This is also, again, something that's meant to be flexible. The goal is not to feel like you're suddenly trapped and have to be beholden to this plan there. You can adjust it. Things can change. Maybe you realize that you want to pivot in a different direction. Maybe you realize that, you want to go to pursue a different career, or something happened and, you had to take a leave of absence for a period of time to deal with a health situation. And so you have to kind of recalibrate some things there. That's totally fine. Again, this is meant to be helpful. It's meant to help you see the big picture in one place. And one of the things that can be nice about it is they can help you identify what might be particularly busy times or other kind of pain points, so that you can plan around that as necessary. If you need to be applying maybe for grants and fellowships that will help support your research in the same semester when you might be teaching a class and also maybe working on your comprehensive exams, that's a lot on your plate at that point there. And so, maybe that means that you need to be thinking about planning for the semester before that to start working on that application for the grant or that fellowship there. So the visual reminder can be a good way of figuring out, okay, when am I going to be particularly busy, or when do I have something that really can't be moved and I really need to prioritize my efforts around that. And here's an example of what this can look like. I made this based on my own graduate experience there. I have a PhD in history. It was a 7-year program that was considered normal time to degree for that. This might be similar to your background. It might be very, very different. The point is not that you need to have anything that looks exactly like this. This is just a way to sort of see what a graduate degree can look like with these sort of things here. My field was history. So for us, it was standard for the fourth year to be the year when you would do your research, which usually meant travel to libraries, archives, other places with the sources you would be working with. And so I knew that going in, and that meant that in year three, one of the things that I was prioritizing was applying for funding that would let me travel to do the research that I needed to do for my dissertation as part of that. Year three was also the year when we had to take our qualifying exams in my program. So, those were things that had to be kept in mind as part of that. I've indicated some conferences that I participated in when those proposals were submitted and when those conferences took place. Also, times when I was TAing and teaching courses here, when I submitted an important journal article, which you can see was submitted in July of year five and wasn't published until April of year seven. So that was a particularly long period of time that involved revising and resubmitting along the way. And so, whatever is the case for your program, whatever categories you would choose, they might not be the same as the ones that I have here, but this might be a useful way to sort of help you see that big picture. And again, think about what are those points when things might be particularly busy, and am I giving myself enough time to be successful with all of those as well? So if this is something you find useful, again, you can use a table like this, you can use an Excel document, whatever works best, whatever makes the most sense for your brain in terms of how you best like to process and see information. I think having some way of seeing that bigger picture so that you're not losing sight of those key milestones can be a really useful way to do that. You can provide a little bit of structure and accountability to those SMART goals in terms of that last piece of really making sure that it's time bound, time dependent here. So I would encourage you to just take a minute. We'll take a couple minutes right here to start filling that out, either on the document itself that I just put in the chat, or just maybe doing a little bit of brainstorming, a pencil and paper, or an open Word document if you're at a computer, whatever makes sense for you. What are the milestones and deadlines you already know right now? What are the things you can already say, yes, this is going to be important, or these are things that I really want to be able to do? Start with that. And if you know beyond that, go ahead and fill in more. If you haven't had a chance to yet, then that's just something maybe then to spend a little bit of time identifying so that you do know what those things are. And I'll flag a couple examples of that in just a minute, but I'll give you a second to do a little bit of reflection, a little bit of brainstorming with your own map. All right, I hope you were able to come up with a few things off the top of your head, or that you have a general sense of where they might fall. Within that, again, these are things that can change. It's really just a way to provide some accountability to make sure that you are following through on the goals that you want to set here. In terms of some next steps to take based on the questions that you've thought a little bit about, based on some of the resources that I flagged here, I would find the answer to some of the questions that I've been posing here if you haven't had a chance to look like this, to look through any of this or to reflect on this up to this point here. What are specific skills or experiences you want to have by the end of your program? start out working list, start doing a little bit of that LinkedIn reflecting, maybe use Imagine PhD or My IDP to begin thinking through some of those things there. You may already be doing this as part of your program. Some graduate programs I recognize automatically or require their students to create individual development plans. There are some grants, if you are doing research for a professor, that might require you to have that as well. If you're not required to do that, I think it's a good practice to have, but this is also a way to provide a little bit of timing for this. I did a version of this workshop for a different audience earlier this week, and someone asked a question about, how often should you check in and reflect on these things there? I would say at least once a year. And if you have some sort of normal meeting, if everybody has to have a meeting, with your advisor where you do a progress report or where you work on an individual development plan, in addition to whatever you might need to do for your program or for university requirements, that's a good time to check in with yourself on some of these things as well here. Um, so thinking about that list and thinking about the timing of skills and experiences you want to have, other things, if you're thinking about an academic track there, if you haven't had a chance to think about what are the important conferences you might want to attend or present at for whatever reason, figuring out what that timeline looks like. What's the cycle? Where do they take place? When do they take place? What would be reasonable in terms of what can I afford to do? Is there funding that I can get through my department or the university that might be able to support me with some of these things here? Um, you know, all of those are useful things to know if you haven't already identified that, but you know that at some point you want to be presenting your work. Same thing with external funding. What are the things I can apply for? Are there things that everybody in my field is sort of knows, and those are the ones that we're all going to be applying for? Are there ones that might be more particular to my specific project or topic here? When are they due? What is their cycle like? Well, again, what year do I need to apply? Do I need to apply a year in advance or 6 months in advance? How long does an application cycle typically look like? That's what I can help you with. So if you've got questions in that area specifically, let's talk. I'll send you this information and you can definitely follow up and schedule a meeting with me and we can get into more detail about that. But that's one important piece there. If you're thinking about publications, where do you want to publish? What are the journals you really want to target? That would be a good fit for your research. That would be good in terms of what you're hoping to have in terms of your publication record for your career. What does that process look like? How long does it typically take? Again, it can vary significantly based on discipline, based on the particular journal there. And then another important question is, when do I want to start applying for positions? Because there's a difference between, what you have done by the time you actually graduate and have that degree in hand versus when you might actually start applying. If you are applying for academic jobs, if you want to be a professor or for some postdocs, you might be applying the fall of the year in which you're planning to graduate in that spring. So we're talking 7, 8 months in advance potentially there. If you're doing a different type of position, that might be a much shorter cycle. You might be, applying a few months in advance of that to make sure that you have enough time to finish your degree as part of that. If you're applying for different types, you might be running different timelines for your search. Maybe you're focusing in the fall on academic jobs, and maybe in the spring you're looking at industry opportunities, and you're open to both of them, and you're just going to want to see what are the best options that sort of emerge from that process. But that does mean that what your CV will look like is potentially different. And so if you want to be able to have that publication on your CV at the time you apply for that faculty job in November, then you need to plan ahead so that that publication is out in November, not just out by the time you finish your program and by the time you've actually graduated. So that timeline piece is going to vary, and it's going to vary depending on the types of positions you're looking at. So keep that in mind as well as you're thinking about when you want to have certain accomplishments that you can list, certain qualifications, abilities as part of your resume or CV. I've already talked a little bit about support from fellowships, which is my office, but I just want to emphasize that in addition to resources from your program, that there are university level resources available to all graduate students, the fellowships office, myself. Also, I would definitely recommend the Career Center. My colleague Nigel Smith there, who works specifically with grad students, is a great resource for any stage of career exploration and preparation of job materials. Nigel does a bunch of great workshops that I hope you'll check out as well, in addition to the personalized guidance that he can provide. And you can schedule appointments on the Handshake platform, and you can schedule appointments with me at calendly.com/grad fellowships. So additional support to follow up on some of the specific areas of experience that you may want to get as you're envisioning what that future resume or CV might look like. I just want to flag here at the end some of the resources that I drew upon in putting together this presentation. Again, I'll send you these slides, and I would encourage you to follow up with any of them to get some additional information if you found this to be helpful. And I'll note as well that the graduate school has some resources for putting together an individual development plan, if that's something you want to think about, as in addition to the resources that I provided here as well. But that is the presentation for this evening. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pause the recording. And again, I'm happy to discuss any of this with you in more detail.